We've seen the armour you wear, we've seen the weapons you might use, we've seen how to control your horse on the battlefield. But when that letter from the king has summoned you to the battlefield, what do you actually do when you're there? And how do you prepare for it? Well, let's find out. We've marked out about 300 yards down the field, which is about the length of an effective bow shot. Yeah, maybe people can shoot a little bit further than that, and some bows won't go as far, but basically 300 yards seems like a good estimate of the effective range of an English longbow. So if you are an armoured cavalryman with a lance, you've got to cross the ground between where they can reach and where you can kill them. How long does it take a mounted knight to cross that ground before the lance can impact on the line of foot? Well, let's find out. That was really interesting. Gossamer did a fantastic job. We covered the 300 yards, which is roughly a bow shot from a standing start, flat out gallop, 15 to 18 seconds. I'm not in armour. I don't think it would affect her very much. I don't think it would slow her down more than perhaps a second. It would mean she couldn't do as many, but that's fine. When you have to go in a coherent mass of soldiers though, and maintain the integrity of the formation, keep that line together, it's taking about 35 seconds, maybe 40 seconds, so well over twice as long. You, as a mounted knight with a lance charge, have to withstand the arrow storm for twice as long as you might expect before you can impact on the foot troops. But the point is, if you are in a flat-out gallop, your impact, your charge, is not going to be as effective. So to have effect on the foot, you have to be coherent. You have to charge home. You have to charge and accelerate towards the enemy. That's the only way that the lance works properly. To use an impact weapon properly, you need to practice, and to practice you need to hit something. And one of the, I guess, classic medieval things we see is a quintain. It is simply a target for hitting with a lance from horseback, but it has a couple of twists that you might not have noticed. It has a weight at the end on a string. Now, we see in the movies that the quintain spins round, and if the knight isn't going fast enough, the weight hits them on the back of the head, which is complete rubbish. I have tried to be hit on the back of the head by that weight, and you just can't do it. So they have to fake it in movies and TV all the time. It doesn't happen. What the weight does is act as a pendulum and act as a resistance lever for your impact, because you're training with the lance, you're training to give and receive shock impact through your body, through the horse, at speed. You can't just do that, you've got to build up to it. So the quintain can be moved around to give you less impact or more impact by moving the centre of rotation and moving the weight itself on the end. You put a heavier weight on the end, it will absorb more energy from you and push back more, so it'll resemble hitting a man in armour. But of course, to begin with, you don't want to be hitting a man in armour straight away. You want to be aiming at the target and doing it gently, so you can build up to the big impact. And so the quintain is one of those devices that was probably used by a lot of squires, possibly not so much by knights themselves once they actually had learnt the technique, but basically it's a graduated way of building up to a full massive impact of a war lance on a target. The other thing about a quintain is you're training your horse too. If you train your horse with an enormous impact as the first thing it experiences, it's going to get scared and it's not going to be a good war horse. You build up to it, like we all do with sports, like we do with all sorts of things. You start slowly and gently and you build up and build up and build up. If you throw a horse into a battle untrained, it'll be useless. If you throw a horse at the Quintin untrained, it'll be useless, it'll get scared. So you start slowly, build up until you can do a full impact charge and repeat it again and again in the battlefield. One of the weapons we've not talked about much for a knight, especially when riding a horse, is the lance. A lance started off basically as a spear from horseback, and we see in the Bayeux tapestry basically a footman's spear, possibly a little longer, can be used couched or it can be used overarm to stab with. And these are both very effective techniques because they were used, but they developed until the lance became a bit of a heavier weapon and a longer weapon and was used almost exclusively in the couched position. It can be used this side and this side, but in effect what it is doing is delivering the tip of steel to the enemy before the enemy can contact you. Remember, on horseback you've got greater speed, you've got greater height, and theoretically with a lance you've got greater reach. It's still a one-shot weapon though, because if you hit somebody hard enough with a lance, it's going to dig into them and possibly the lance is going to break. So what you do in that circumstance, you either hang around and draw your secondary weapons and flail around you for a bit, or, which I think is more likely, you get out of there and get another lance, and then you reset the line and then you have another attack. So in a way, a knight in armour is a little bit like a missile. You shoot it at the enemy, it does its job, and then you go back, you get another one, and you shoot it again at the enemy. As opposed to a foot soldier who has to stand there and absorb the impacts and basically can't really go back and get another weapon. So the lance itself is used in all sorts of complex ways, but basically it's a long shaft of wood with a spike at the end. Using a lance properly requires quite a lot of skill. It's longer than a footman's spear and you can't really use it two-handed from horseback. You sort of can, but most people don't bother because you're using the range, you might have a shield, and it means you're going to have to use it with one hand, which means you need to practice with it. And I'm pretty sure, just back then where they used wooden swords against the pell, I'm pretty sure they'd have used wooden or blunted lances against the Quintin. This is nothing more than a pole of wood. Just like the wooden swords that the medieval people used to practice against the pell when they're on foot and using swords, rather than using real swords to chop up the wood, what you do is you use a wooden sword and it develops your own body. My hypothesis is that they probably used the same thing when they were jousting practice or lance using practice, because quite frankly, why use a solid tip that's sharp against a target when you don't need to? It's also safer and these things are much cheaper to use. So the lance technique that I'm using is you can brace the lance on your toe to begin with, just to hang around and walk around with it. That's fairly straightforward. When you want to actually take a charge at somebody, you have to lift the lance into an active position, which is probably something like this. There are saddles with cutouts on them, or hooks or cups on them. You can brace it like this, you can have it on the top of your saddle. But basically you're holding the lance vertically, then the lance comes up underneath your arm, and then you lower the lance down towards the target. And it might be on this side, which is war side, or it might be on this side, which is sports side, or joust à plaisance. But you can see that I'm balancing the lance, not really holding it. I don't need to hold it in my hand. I find I do hold it. I try to keep my thumb out of the way. I do hold it, but it's effectively braced underneath the arm. You squeeze the arm, and arguably you don't even need your hand. So you can use your hand to guide. That's the idea, use your hand to guide. Normally I would have a lance rest, which is a hook attached to my cuirass, which makes it even easier to hold the lance like this. But you can, by squeezing and using your armour, the lance can actually be horizontal anyway. When you are aiming a lance tip, a lot of people think the lance bobs up and down, and it does, but that bobbing up and down comes from you, the rider, and the horse as well. But what I find with a metal tip on the end of the lance is surprisingly straight and level. And if you are a good rider and you balance some of your weight in the stirrups and you lean properly into the saddle and you've got a good horse, that lance point will stay pretty much on target until you strike it. One of the slightly unnerving things about jousting against people is that one of the easiest parts of the armour to aim for is the eye slot, which is of course the place that people can get killed in a joust. And one of the reasons why we don't often allow headshots in modern jousts is because of the increased danger to the actual face and the head. But it is interesting that if you're trying to aim for somebody's head, you sort of have to aim. I find my eyes going to their eyes and their eye slot, and that means the point tends to go to the eye slot again, which is very, very dangerous indeed. This is a bit more of a sophisticated lance than the simple polar of ash I was using before. This has got a shaped hand grip, or maybe it's not a hand grip, but we do see it used as a hand grip. You can hold it like this and couch it, and it works quite well. You can also use that under your arm, so it acts as a kind of grapper, acts as a substitute kind of point for fixing the lance to your cuirass. This one uses a false tip. This uses a replacement tip on the end, depending on what kind of style of jousting you're doing. Just makes it cheaper. This particular shape is actually quite bad for your thumb, because any impact will drive the lance itself back into your thumb, and that thumb will get damaged or broken even. So I kind of call these thumb breakers, this design, and that's why I think they were probably used like that as opposed to that. But we see both in the manuscripts, so I guess people had their thumbs broken back in the medieval times. One of the things to remember about a mounted knight is that they very rarely fought on their own. The idea is you have a massed rank of armed and armoured men attacking in a unit. And to be effective on the battlefield, that unit has to be coordinated. So it would have had to have practiced together. And the closer that unit can be to each other, the more impact their attack and their charge is going to have on the foot. So you would ride knee to knee. You would be squished either side. So you can't go anywhere even if you wanted to. And all the horses would be stallions, of course, and they would be really raring to go. So the sight of a proper charge of knights on the medieval battlefield must have been terrifying. The ground would have shaken. Quite frightening if you're a foot soldier. It's quite frightening in reenactment battles, let alone when you know they're actually going to try and kill you. The Crusade era gives us some interesting illustrations of how knights were seen to fight. So they talked about the Frankish knights, and they talked about a charge of Frankish knights being able to break the very walls of Byzantium. Now obviously that's an exaggeration. You're not going to charge with lances against a solid wall, but it shows you the sheer kind of power behind a properly structured knightly charge. There are some interesting illustrations. They talked about throwing apples at a group of Frankish knights. So this is the Muslim chroniclers talking about the Frankish knights on crusade. They talked about chucking a bag of apples over the knights, which might sound a bit strange, but they actually commented that not a single apple would hit the ground because they were literally riding knee to knee. And the pressure of the horses coming from the side would have created a mass lump of men and horse that would charge at the target in one kind of great clot of muscle. So you have to think about it. In the movies, we see one knight charging down one foot soldier and going past and riding through the lines, but the foot are close together and the knights that are mounted are close together, and they are pushing from the sides to create that cohesion, because what you need is an enormous amount of energy going into the initial clash. Your lances have a big effect and you disrupt the foot completely. Once you've done that, you might have lost your spear or your lance. You move over to melee weapons and hammers and axes and swords. The medieval knight was a major threat on the battlefield of the time. They were not invulnerable, but they were very, very good at what they did when trained properly and led properly. There were many challenges they faced though. The terrain, for one. Terrain can bring down a mounted knight because it can be boggy. Foot soldiers, properly trained, can coordinate and do a lot of damage, and there are more foot soldiers than there are mounted knights. But the most deadly thing that a knight would face was ranged weapons, the crossbow, and for hundreds of years, the English longbow. This nemesis of the armoured knight brought down thousands of knights in its time. Let's find out more about that next time. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Don't forget to use that notification button, and we'll see you next time.